Walter Elias Disney. He was the co-founder of the media empire and the imaginative superforce behind the creation of Mickey Mouse and Disneyland. He's so legendary that his truths are hard to discern from fiction. I'm Alex the Historian, and for the last 15 years I've been studying the history of the Disney Company in an effort to better my understanding. With the Disney fanbase growing exponentially in recent years, and so many rumors still swirling about this honored man, I've created this video series in order to delve deeper, to tackle the ever-elusive question of just exactly who was Walt Disney? When you think of Walt Disney, it's hard to believe that he grew up with such humble beginnings, and with parents that were quite ordinary. Flora and Elias Disney were rather strict parents, but that was typical of people who lived in Middle America around the turn of the 20th century. Many expectations were placed on family life, and Elias struggled to maintain steady employment to support his family. There wasn't much time or inspiration for hugs and kisses, and Elias himself was always under intense pressure. He had a quick temper and demanded that each child pull their weight one way or another. If Walt didn't work hard enough, fast enough, or behave correctly, he was subjected to a beating from his father. Now, let's be clear, Elias Disney was a good man. He was devoted to his family and loved his wife and kids unconditionally. Later in life, Walt would stress that he loved his father. He respected him greatly, because the man never gave up when times were hard. But as Walt grew up, he felt the need to distance himself from his father's overbearing nature. And eventually, Walt would promise himself that his own children would never grow to fear their father the way he once feared his. Walt found much comfort in drawing, animating, and pursuing other creative outlets along his career. But it wasn't until he began to share his life with Lillian Bounds that he was suddenly immersed in a feeling of unconditional love. Lillian was hired into the new Disney Brothers studio to work as an ink and painter for Walt's short cartoons and films. As a gesture of courtesy, he would drive home the small staff of ink and paint women, always being sure that Lillian would be the last to arrive home. That way he had more time with her. "I think my dad fell in love with her almost immediately. She was an independent little lady," recalled their daughter Diane. Although Walt vowed that he wouldn't marry before the age of 25 and had $10,000 saved up, he simply couldn't resist. Their relationship blossomed, and they married on July 13th, 1925. Lillian was Walt's supportive partner, and many times his only confidant. Aside from their marriage, they were also the best of friends. Walt poured his affection to her, and she loved every bit of it. Lillian was not the kind of wife that America's social propaganda had demanded she be. Lillian wasn't one to blindly support Walt or agree to every decision he made. In fact, one of the greatest reasons Walt respected Lillian was because, to him, she spoke candidly and sincerely. He admitted that he didn't always agree with her take on certain subjects, but oftentimes she was right. Lillian didn't bathe in the glamour of Hollywood during the time that Walt's fame started to build. She kept her integrity and made sure Walt was always well-grounded. If you had never known how famous Walt and Lillian were, you would see them as a very resourceful couple with a healthy love and respect for each other. Walt's nephew, Roy E. Disney, once remarked that Lillian was always prepared to speak the truth, tough and warm and loving at the same time. She was a very special person. You couldn't help loving her, and you'd never forget her, or her hearty laugh. In the early 1930s, Walt and Lily were ready to start a family, but unfortunately Lillian had suffered a miscarriage. The doctor expressed that Lillian may continue to have trouble conceiving. This caused Lillian to fall into a deep depression. In that day and age, society dictated that the main job of a woman was to carry children. Walt was always in disagreement with that expectation, and never pressured her to conceive. In fact, he too felt her sadness, and discouraged her from feeling obligated to keep trying. Eventually, Lily did conceive, and in 1933, little Diane Disney was born. It was recommended by their physician that Lillian not try to conceive a second child due to her health complications. So when they decided to expand their family again, they decided to adopt 6-week-old Sharon. Walt and Lily cherished their 2 daughters and kept the 2 of them out of the spotlight and insisted that they wouldn't spoil their children in order to raise them with as much normalcy as possible. Walt even drove his girls to school every morning from kindergarten all the way to high school. Diane reflected about weeknights with her father. "We always ate dinner late because Dad worked late at the studio. He would tell us about what he was doing, but he also wanted to know about our lives too, and he would listen." Sometimes, Walt would need to take them into the studio with him. During those times, they would follow him from office to office as he talked to animators, and the girls got to see all the latest things being dreamed up. Other times, Walt would bring their bicycles with them so they could ride around on the studio lot, but always afterwards, Walt would take them to the beach or a park. My Aunt Ruth told me that Dad once said, "I want to have 10 kids, and I'm going to let them do anything they want." That's pretty much the way he treated Sharon and me. He gave us liberty, but he didn't spoil us. And that's not to say that Diane and Sharon were free from discipline. As kids do, once in a while they would act up, and Walt would ground them or explain their wrongs to them. Diane continued by saying, "I don't think he had a fierce temper, but there were times when I felt his temper. He only got mad when he felt hurt." Walt was very much in touch with his feelings. He was a man unafraid to shed a tear. In fact, on the day Diane was to marry Ron, she was given away at the altar by her father, and tears formed in his eyes. When the couple was exchanging vows, Diane looked over at Walt to see him sniffling, and tears streaming down his cheeks. When Diane and Sharon eventually settled down with their husbands and started having kids, Walt fell in love with his grandchildren. The Sunday tradition of spending time with Grandpa Walt started up again, and he often invited the grandkids for a sleepover in his apartment at Disneyland. Walt Disney loved his family, and his special relationship with his brother was no different. As a child, Walt looked up to Roy, not just because he was older, but because Roy was a responsible young man. Roy was pursuing his own career, and he possessed wonderful human qualities like empathy, love, ambition, and sensibility. While Walt himself was mostly all ambition and less sensibility, he always looked to Roy to provide the example. When Walt moved out to California after the failure of his Laugh-O-Gram studio, he asked Roy to go in with him on creating a new company. At the time, Roy was at a veterans hospital recovering from tuberculosis, but Walt convinced him to leave the hospital and join him. The two brothers set out to create the Disney Brothers Studio in 1923, and while Walt at the time was considered the head executive of the small business, he relied considerably on Roy to manage the finances. When the company grew dramatically during the 1930s, Walt had to take a step back from the leadership role, allowing his brother to assume control of what we would refer today as CEO. Roy and Walt had a healthy sibling relationship. It's true that a lot of books and stories will tell you that they argued a lot, but it's important to know that they loved each other greatly. Roy and Walt were involved in each other's lives. Roy and Edna Disney would often have dinner with Walt and Lily, and the two brothers enjoyed watching sports together or taking their families on vacation together. The brothers only fought about business dealings. Otherwise, they got along like old friends, which they were. Family was a large part of Walt's life. It's unquestionable. He had a lot of family around him that supported him through his career. While everyone at one point or another had questioned his ambitions and his logic, they never held him back or shot down his dreams. Even as Walt became a celebrity, his parents continued to stand by his side. Roy and Walt continued to care for their parents as they aged, and as for his father Elias, Walt and him became much closer to each other. Elias was once a construction contractor, and so ever since day one of the park's operation, Elias Disney's name has been immortalized on a window on Main Street at Disneyland. It's impossible to assume things about Walt's life, but as Diane put it, "My father was not a complicated man. I think Dad was very easy to read. He was always straightforward, never devious." And with that in mind, we can look at how this man cherished his children, how he rewarded his brother, how he provided for his parents, and how he loved his wife. And we can say with certainty, Walt Disney was a family man.